Now we're going to talk about a period in the United States, a little bit of American history that most folks are unaware of, the huge controversy surrounding comic books in the early 1950s. Often in my basic U.S. history survey course, I assign this book by David Hyde, The 10-Cent Plague, which is a very good history of the time period and the things that were going on. I also direct students' attention to the more recent work of my friend Carol Tilley from the University of Illinois, whose research has given us an even better perspective of what was going on. In the midst of all the paranoia about juvenile delinquency and the Red Scare that was happening at the same time, and some people connecting those together and thinking that entertainment was a communist plot to produce juvenile delinquents, this guy came onto the scene, Frederic Wertham, originally from Germany, a child psychologist who, beginning in the late 1940s, started leading a movement against comic books. Now, why is that? Well, in his research, he said, he had, in his research working with troubled children and juvenile delinquents, he noticed they all read comic books. So that must be what the problem is. Carol Tilley has, in her research, actually shown that Wertham fabricated a lot of his research. He just made a bunch of stuff up. But even if he hadn't, he could just as easily have said all the juvenile delinquents that he's talked to, all of them rode bicycles. So therefore, bicycles must be evil, right? But that's not where the focus was. The focus was on comic books, and so he was interviewed in several magazines, newspapers, which kind of ignited this movement to do away with comic books. There were giant burnings of comic books. And then in 1954, this book was released, Seduction of the Innocent, in which he laid out his case on the evil influence of comic books on today's youth.
The real question is this: are comic books good or are they not good? If you want to raise a generation that is half stormtroopers and half cannon fodder with a dash of illiteracy, then comic books are good. In fact, they are perfect. Just a very short while ago, an 11-year-old boy committed a holdup in California and killed a woman of 42. And when the police came to arrest this 11-year-old boy, his older brother, who's 20, said, if you want to know the cause of all this, here it is. It's these rotten comic books. Cut them out, and things like this would not happen.
One thing that Wertham focused on a lot was his assertion that comic books are trying to turn your kids gay. Now, you may or may not have been aware of this, but anti-gay sentiment was also a large part of the McCarthy era and the Red Scare. Particularly McCarthy personally, often accused, kind of in a subtle way, sometimes not so subtle, accused various people of being secretly gay. And since being homosexual was illegal, most people who did that were secretive about it, because it could not only end their careers, but it could even get them arrested and sent to prison. And the idea was that having gay people working for the government was a security risk, right? Because if the communists found out that they're gay, they could blackmail them and force them to betray their country. Well, Wertham is not concerned about high government officials. He's concerned about little kids. So his concern was just that it is, in his opinion, immoral to be encouraging homosexual attitudes and kind of gay sub-themes in these comic books. And some people who suspected all this was part of a communist plot would look at that as a way to weaken American society and make it easier for the Russians to take over. But however you look at it, one of the examples that he honed in on was Batman and Robin, alias Bruce and Dick, who you had a situation where you've got an adult man, millionaire, who is the legal guardian, but not a relative and not even an adopted relative of a teenage boy that lives with him. And they're running around, sliding down bat poles into bat caves and stuff like that. And Wertham was able to isolate some images from the comics that certainly were not intended the way that he took them, but that sort of taken alone kind of reinforced, and he was able to use as examples. Look at all this gay stuff going on, right? So here's Bruce and Dick sunbathing naked and waking up in bed together, and stuff like that. In this quote from Wertham, I think it's important to take a look at a couple of the words that are used. For example, Robin, alias Dick Grayson, is described as a handsome, ephebic boy, usually shown in his uniform with bare legs. What does ephebic mean? Well, if you look at the dictionary, ephebic in the English language means a boy that has just reached puberty. But in a historic context, in a classical context, in classical Rome and Greece, the term ephebic love was used to describe a homosexual relationship between an adult man who is the dominant partner and a teenaged boy. Here is a further description of Robin by Wertham. He often stands with his legs spread, the genital region discreetly evident. Now, don't get confused by the use of that word discreetly. That is not discreet spelled E-E-T, which means careful and circumspect. This is discreet spelled E-T-E, which means individually distinct, something that stands out on its own. Wertham was also concerned about gay undertones in Wonder Woman. Now, Wonder Woman was created by William Moulton Marston, pictured here, under the pen name Charles Moulton. Marston was a psychologist, and along with his wife Elizabeth, had gained some notice by inventing the lie detector. Marston was also an outspoken feminist, outspoken defender of women's rights. He in fact said that the world would be a much better place if women were in charge of it. And he became a defender of comic books early on. This is like we're talking 10 years before Frederic Wertham. We're talking about 1939, 1940, when Superman and Batman had come out and become really popular, and some newspapers were criticizing comics at that time, not for creating juvenile delinquencies or making your kids gay, but just making your kids dumb. And so he wrote an impassioned essay that was published in newspapers that was a defense of comic books. Well, national publications, that would later be known as DC, they wanted to have a female superhero that could appeal to little girl readers, right, and make more money. And this seemed like the ideal guy to write it. Of course, the idea of having a woman write it never entered anyone's mind. So they hired Marston to create a female superhero, and he came up with Wonder Woman. Now, there are some things that that national publications, alias DC Comics, didn't know about Marston, including the fact that in addition to being a feminist, he was really into S&M. He was really into bondage, and he also was in a polyamorous relationship, essentially a three-way marriage with him and his wife Elizabeth and his graduate student Olive Byrne, who happened to be the niece of Margaret Sanger of Planned Parenthood. And a lot of those things that they may have caused the company to think twice about having him create their female character. A lot of those things became evident in how he presented Wonder Woman. She was from an island where only women lived, the island of the Amazons, where there was apparently a lot of wrestling going on. There was a lot of wrestling and grappling among female characters in his books. There was a lot of people being tied up. Remember, he's into bondage. In fact, Wonder Woman has a magic lasso, and if she ties you up with it, then you have to do what she says. And probably the most blatant thing, except that you know, perhaps due to their educational limits, the publishers of DC didn't catch on to this. But superheroes had frequently they would have like battle cries. Superman would say, "Great Scott." Wonder Woman would say, "Suffering Sappho." Well, maybe you know who Sappho was. Maybe you don't. Sappho was a Greek poet a couple of thousand years ago or so, known as Sappho of Lesbos. She was a poet who ran a school for girls and wrote a lot of romantic poetry about her female students. In fact, that's where the term lesbian comes from. And it's also led to another term, sapphic love, which is kind of a synonym for lesbianism. So that was Wonder Woman's rallying cry. There was a fascinating movie about the Marston family that came out just a couple of years ago. But you can see where someone like Frederic Wertham would really latch on to this stuff. This is the movie that I referenced, which came out in 2017, the same year as the first Wonder Woman movie. Wertham's main concern, though, about comics was violence. He believed that it was the violence that was causing children to become juvenile delinquents. And that violence showed up particularly in horror comics and crime comics, which were two of the popular genres in the late 40s and early 50s. Superheroes had become kind of passe at that point. And although almost all companies were putting out crime and horror comics, the company that got the most attention, because I don't think they necessarily uh, did it the worst. I think that you could say they were doing it the best because they were selling really well, was EC Comics, that had originally been educational comics. That's what the EC stood for. When it was founded by Max Gaines, who was one of the people on the ground floor of creating comic books. But Max Gaines had died in a boating accident, and his young son, William Gaines, had taken over. And so the EC was changed to stand for entertainment or entertaining comics. And you've probably heard of at least one of these, Tales from the Crypt. The artwork and the stories in these books, again, not just EC, but several companies, really was pretty gruesome. Like, for example, this image of a young lady about to have her eyeball popped by a hypodermic needle. All this culminated in live televised hearings before the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency in 1954, presided over by Tennessee Senator Estes Kefauver, who was at that time running for the Democratic nomination for president. They presented expert witnesses from various categories, including Frederic Wertham himself, who took the stand, and William Gaines, publisher of EC Comics, who's pictured there. He made a game effort to defend his industry, but he was kind of nervous, wasn't at his best really, and in the eyes of some people, didn't come off looking or sounding that good. But like I said, he did make a game attempt.
2 decades ago, my late father was instrumental in starting the comic magazine industry. He edited the first few issues of the first modern comic magazine, Famous Funnies.
Famous what?
Funnies. I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wertham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
Much like the NCAA in Teddy Roosevelt's time, the industry decided to censor themselves rather than risk government censorship. So they created the Comics Code Authority, which all the comics publishers signed on to. They agreed to submit to this authority in order to have your comic put on the comic book racks. It had to have this stamp in the upper right-hand corner. And there were certain things that you just weren't allowed to do. For example, in order to get that seal, it had to be approved by the CCA censors. You couldn't use the words crime, terror, or horror in the title of your comic book anymore. You couldn't show vampires, werewolves, zombies, witches, or ghouls. You could not imply drug use, and no character could commit a crime and get away with it. So these new rules were applied in the mid-1950s after those Senate hearings, and that would be the case for decades to come. In order to get your comic book on the spinner racks where they sold comics at grocery stores, convenience stores, etc., you had to have this stamp. In the 1960s and 70s, you had what were called underground comics that were published by small independent publishers, usually in New York or San Francisco, that had adult themes, frequently had nudity and sexual content, a lot of drug references, and these did not have the Comics Code stamp, nor could they have gotten one. They were sold in head shops. They were sold sometimes on the street. And they didn't have very big print runs, and they made practically no money. So that was pretty well going to be your situation if you were publishing a comic book and you didn't get that seal. The CCA did loosen its restrictions on horror content in the early 1970s, and that's why you had all of a sudden a wave of horror-related characters showing up at that time, like Ghost Rider, Blade the Vampire Hunter, Swamp Thing, and so forth. By the early 2000s, comic books weren't sold on spinner racks in convenience stores anymore, hardly anywhere. They instead were sold in comic shops. And most of the major companies pretty well started ignoring the CCA and its seal. In the early 2000s, Finally, the last two companies that were still using it, DC and Archie, stopped using it in 2011. So it's no longer a thing, really. But for about 40 years, it could make you or break you if you were in the comics publishing business, whether you had this censorship approved seal or not. The last straw for William Gaines came in 1956. A story that had been scheduled to run in incredible science fiction was rejected by the censors, and he had to come up with something else to put in its place. And so it was decided that they would rerun an old story that had appeared before in 1953. And in fact, when this story that had run before first ran, it gained critical praise, and it was singled out for praise by various famous science fiction writers. It was called Judgment Day. Now, the story basically is that you've got an astronaut from Earth, and he has a space helmet on, you can't see his face, goes to this planet that has applied for membership, essentially, in sort of like the Federation or whatever. And this planet is made up completely of robots. And so the Earth astronauts are there to sort of check them out and see if they're advanced enough to be allowed to join the organization. Turns out there's actually two kinds of robots, orange ones and blue ones. And they are exactly alike in how they're constructed. And the only difference is, well, there's two differences. One difference is their color, orange and blue. And the other difference is the programming that they receive. You see, the orange robots run things and believe themselves to be inherently superior to the blue robots, who are essentially a servile race and are only allowed a certain amount of programming, a certain amount of education, if you will. So the astronaut is pretty ticked off by this and by the racist attitudes of the orange robots. And he informs them, you know what, you still have a ways to go before you're advanced enough to join our interstellar organization. Don't worry, though, because Earth used to have problems like that too, and we worked through them. And then the astronaut leaves, and only then, in the final panel, the final picture of the story, do we see the astronaut take off his helmet, and he's a black guy. He's a black guy, and he's sweating, indicating that he's somehow like worked up about what he had just experienced. Imagine that. So that was viewed as a great story, 1953, when it came out. That was before the Comics Code Authority. When they tried to run it again in 1956, the censors rejected it. And the reason they rejected it was they feared that readers in the South would be offended by the idea of a black guy being an astronaut. What are you trying to say? They're capable or intelligent or something? That's crazy. And so they demanded that they could have the whole story, but they had to change that last picture and have the astronaut be a white guy, which Gaines refused to do because that essentially destroys the entire point of the story. So then the censors said, well, okay, after he had threatened to go to the press and tell them that the CCA was racist. So they said, okay, you can have it be a black guy, but you can't show perspiration because that looks too much like tears, and it makes it look like, discrimination is bad. And people in the South, white people in the South, would be upset about that. So they weren't going to allow him to do it. He did it anyway. He did it anyway, put the book out without the seal. And that was the last comic book that EC Comics put out, because they went out of the comic book business intentionally rather than submit to this censorship. However, Gaines did have an alternative plan. In 1952, EC Comics had introduced a humor comic book called Mad. So, what they decided to do was to keep Mad, stop publishing all the other comic books, but change Mad from being a four-color comic book sold on the spinner racks with other comic books, and instead make it a black and white magazine that the magazine dimensions are larger than a comic book. So it doesn't fit in the spinner racks. It would have to be sold on the shelf with other magazines, like Popular Mechanics, Time Magazine, stuff like that. By doing that, they no longer had to have the Comics Code Authority stamp because they technically weren't a comic book, even though probably at least half of their content was in comic book format, just in black and white. And they were very successful. In fact, I'd say they made a whole lot of money over the years as Mad became kind of a staple for adolescents in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, 80s, into the 90s. Magazine finally stopped producing new material just around 2015, 2016, something like that. So they were around for a very long time and were extremely influential, especially in the late 1950s and in the 1960s, because they had this sort of countercultural approach. They were extremely sarcastic toward authority, toward all authority, and they encouraged kids to question authority. And in doing so, were sort of the inspiration for a lot of humor later produced by baby boomers. And here is a picture of William Gaines, who remained in charge for decades after the transition. Here's this picture is him in his later years unleashing his inner hippie. One more thing about comic books before we move on to a different Cold War pop culture topic. Superheroes started to make a comeback in the late 1950s when DC Comics reintroduced some of their 1940s characters like the Flash. And in the early 1960s in particular, when Marvel Comics unleashed a whole barrage of new superhero characters that were extremely popular, almost all of them co-created by Stan Lee. And if you look at these in particular, some of the more popular ones, what do they all have in common? They all got their powers through radiation, accidental exposure, or perhaps in some cases ill-advised intentional exposure to radiation. But wait, you might say, the X-Men didn't come about because of an accident with radiation. They're mutants, right? Well, they were referred to as the children of the atom. And in the very first issue, Professor X is explaining in a speech that the number of mutants around the world has risen substantially in the last several years because of atomic testing. And the original X-Men were all teenagers. This is 1964, 1965. So if they're all teenagers, when were they all born? The late 40s, maybe at the latest, the early 50s, the early days of the Cold War. Now, most of the superheroes introduced back in the 30s and 40s had magic as their origins, such as Captain Marvel alias Shazam, Wonder Woman, the original Green Lantern. Superman was an aberration there. He was an alien from outer space. But now, just like, this is coming full circle, just like with the horror, the things that scared people, by now, the early 60s, the hope for heroism lies in mastering radiation and in mastering the power of the atom.